Hello and welcome to this episode of Midlife Men. Me, Philip Briscoe. Today I'm joined by Steve Whittle. Steve is the founder of Tough to Talk, which is a men's mental health charity really focused on trying to help business and community leaders reduce male suicide. It's essentially the core of what Tough to Talk's about. So, Steve, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Perhaps you could just start by introducing yourself and maybe give a little bit of a context to what we're talking about today.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like you introduced me brilliantly, I am the founder of Tough to Talk. And Tough to Talk is the first UK charity that isn't taking the problem of male suicide to men. We are focusing on destroying the stigma, working with communities, business leaders in male-dominated spaces to help them communicate more effectively with men and kind of, making it okay to be, masculine and, be able to talk about their problems, because there is a disconnect between, men being manly and also having that ability to be able to talk. So one of the things that I always say is the most masculine thing you can do is take care of yourself, and then you can take care of other people. And if we do that more, then we will guide more men away from, them taking their own lives.
And so I believe you have, your own personal experience, perhaps you'd like to share with us.
Yeah, sure. On the face of it, I'm like an Instagram profile. It's like my whole life is amazing. And in our Tough Talks, I do this beginning where I talk about how my life is in order. I joined the Navy when I was 17, had a great career. I did some fabulous stuff around the world. I left there and became, a coach, and I won awards for doing that. Then I looked after 13 health clubs for their fitness product for Virgin Active. Then I went into marketing, and it's fantastic. I've got an amazing girlfriend, a great dog. I've got all of these things. But what people don't understand, didn't realize, underneath all of that, up until a couple of years ago, nobody knew that I suffered with chronic PTSD. I have got ADD, and I've been diagnosed with depression, which I have to have counseling for now, and I have to take medication. I have to live my life in a certain way to make sure it stays on track. And on 3 separate times, I've had suicide behaviours where I planned and tried to act out to be able to take my own life. And it wasn't until the third time, don't really remember in that moment what made me reach out and get some help. But the crisis team were around my house in no time. And the thing that resonated and stuck in my head was, you're not alone. There's lots of men who feel this way. And I thought, that's just not true. That's got to be crap, because I know so many men, and not one of them is telling me they're like me, or not one of them is telling me that they are, suffering with any kind of crises in their life. So I went to the go-to place of all go-to places, went to Google, started Googling the stats, and the sources were incredible. The World Health Organization, the National Centre for the Prevention of Suicide and Training, the NHS, UK Gov, all of these stats are out there showing that actually the situation is so dire that suicide is the number one preventable cause of death on the planet. Over 700,000 people dying every year from something that is preventable. And of all of those people who are dying, 2/3 of them, men. We're 3 times more likely to die by suicide than women. So then that sent me into, then I started steamrolling then and trying to find out more information to find out, well, why is that happening? And why do I not know about it? Why do I not know that, 1 in 20 men, or 1 in 20 people, I should say, are suffering with maybe a mental health problem? And, 1 in 5 people consider suicide as an option. It's just crazy numbers. And that's what inspired me to go, do you know what? We need to make a change, but we have to make that change in a different place, because there are some fabulous societies out there and organizations. You have the Samaritans, you have Mind, NHS, for example, they're fabulous as well. Then you've got like men only ones like Manshed and Walk and Talks and all of these things that are dealing directly with men. And if men wanted the help and they felt like they could get it, they will be given it. But why weren't they? Because I know I'm talking loads now, but 32% is the maximum number I could find of men who are taking up psychological services in the UK. So then when you marry that with men are 3 times more likely to die by suicide and also 3 times less likely to take help or seek out help, not take help, seek out help, there's a massive gap there. And that all comes down to the stigma. And that is the stigma for reaching out and appearing weak, which all boils down to gender bias that we're taught from when we're very young, the stigma, the social stigma around men appearing weak. Men feel that they're waving the white flag if they ask for help. You couple that with toxic masculinity, then we've got a real problem, a real crisis in the UK.
So why do you think then that, and this may be a personal question, but what were the factors that led you to the place that you got to? And would you say there's commonality with other men?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So the suicide continuum is as we said, is a continuum. It's a linear line from no thoughts of suicide to suicide behaviours and then acting on them. And in between that gap, there are lots of things that happen in a person's life. So this is men and women. The continuum is the same for men and women, but men just react a little bit differently to it. Women have a superpower. So if any women are listening to this, I don't want you to think that we don't care about female suicide. We absolutely do. But men are just suffering worse right now. They're not getting the help they need, I should say, right now. And in that suicide continuum, there are many factors that we need to consider. And so there are, of course, psychological factors, mental health factors. There's identity factors such as, being a man, being a woman, being LGBTQ. There's biological factors. Maybe you have a genetic problem, an illness, or you might have an imbalance of chemistry in your head. You may have current life issues that are happening to you right now. You might have been made redundant. Your wife might have left you and taken the kids. And, of course, there is past history. You might have trauma. So for me, I had 3 episodes of trauma in my life, which I never dealt with, which then led to complex PTSD. Then I became depressed. So then I had that depression then was making me feel low, making me feel unworthy. I often felt that I wasn't adding any value. And then I got to the point when it got really bad that I believed I wasn't adding any value to anybody's life. And the most ideal solution was for me not to be there, would be to just die and make everybody else's life easier. And so if you were to look at all of those 5 factors that we spoke about, I had 3 of them. So I had my past history for all my trauma, I had my psychological effects, and of course I had current life situations going on. So all of those combined meant that I had to go and get help. But I didn't, and that's where the problem lies now with men, is that there is a disconnect between what they're going through in their life and reaching help. And in that disconnect is where the stigma lies.
And so you now, looking back, can identify those factors. But for men living in the moment who perhaps can't unravel or dissect why they're feeling like this, that must make it even more difficult to get help to people when they need it.
No, absolutely.
And so there's also, is there a difference between people who actually want, as you were saying, just don't want to be here, they actually do want to end their lives, and people that don't want to die, but they don't know what else to do, and so they look at suicide as an option? Can you categorize, behavior in that way?
No, I don't think you can. If in almost every case, when you speak to somebody who is having thoughts of suicide, so they are having suicide behaviours, so they're preparing for it, and they have a date, they know when they're going to do it, they know they're going to have to do it. And if you were to ask those people, do you want to die? In almost every case, they'll say no. I just want the pain to stop. Because they don't want to die. They just want whatever's going on in their life just to end. And if you could take that away, that would be amazing. In their state as they are right now, they're thinking, well, that's my only solution. It's like the charity runs suicide first aid courses where we run a course on understanding suicide and then how to give an intervention if you need to. I should say that at any point on the suicide continuum, you can bring somebody back. The further they go down the suicide continuum, the more help they're probably going to require. because you've got people with fleeting moments going, I'm better off dead, to those people who I know I'd be better off dead. When we intervene with somebody who is having suicide behaviours, so they've planned it and they have a time to do it, we never say to the person who is planning their death, we never say to them, are you going to do something stupid? Because in most cases, they don't believe what they're doing is stupid. What they're doing is the solution to their problems. So, of course, when you ask them are they going to do something stupid, they go, no, absolutely they don't. And because they don't want to be trouble, they'll then deflect.
So talking about early intervention then, or intervention at any stage along that continuum, how obvious is it, and this may be a silly question, how obvious is it for somebody, someone's partner or brother or colleague or friend, how obvious is it to spot signs, especially if somebody is appearing from the outside to be living the Instagram life, as you referred to earlier?
Yeah, absolutely. It's incredibly difficult, and I'll explain why. One of the stats that I read that blew my mind was that 80% of all men who die by suicide are functioning adults, which means they've got jobs, they've got friends and family, they might have a social life. And when they die, you hear people say comments like, I never saw that coming. They may have been life and soul of the party, and they might have done something, fun and outgoing, the night before it happened, and it's a real shock to everybody. And that's 80% of men. So when you consider that, 2/3 of all suicides are men, of those 2/3, 80% of them, we wouldn't have even seen it coming. So with those people, it's incredibly difficult to spot because they are going out of their way to hide it. You then get men with higher levels of empathy, who are much more engaged with how they feel, much more engaged with the people around them. And they may say things that you might pick up on. So when we're looking around us at all the people around us, I've got 4 things that I would always want you to be aware of. What do you see? When you're working with somebody or you're living with somebody, what do you see in their behaviors? Do you see things that change? Are they normally pristine and now they're really unkept? Or are you seeing them give their gifts, their things away or something like that? And what do you know about that person? Do you know that that's one of those 5 factors that we spoke about? Have they become recently ill? Have they recently told you about some past trauma? There's their current situation. Has the man recently been divorced and the children have been taken away? So what do you know about that person? And then what do you hear? What sort of things that they say? This might sound counterintuitive, but you might get a man who is normally quite down or very straight-laced, is all of a sudden really happy. And one of the reasons why they're really happy is because they've made a decision. They've come up with the solution to their problems. Or it could go the other way, normally very happy and jolly, and they've gone really sad. So you just be aware of the people around you in the environment. And when those 3 things start to trigger, stuff in your head and you go, actually, something's not quite right. Your spider senses are going off. Then the next thing you need to do is to be brave. Challenge what you see and hear and so on. And if you can't do it, be brave enough to bring it to the attention of somebody else, which is easy in an organization because you take it to a line manager or somebody like that who will have a system in place, you would hope, to be able to deal with this stuff. So to answer your original question, for most men, it is not easy to spot.
So if you're playing weekly 5-side football, or you're in the pub or whatever, and you notice some unusual behaviours in a good friend, as you said, you have to be brave, but that's difficult. How would you go about trying to raise that with them? How do you do that in a unqualified way where you don't quite know what you're doing and you don't know the sort of response you're going to get, and you might be wrong, and then what are the consequences of that?
Absolutely. I mean, and that basically comes down to fear, and it's a right fear, because it's the fear of rejection. Imagine if you said something and they flew off the handle. You'd go, oh, okay, well, maybe I shouldn't say something. But I'm fairly confident for most people listening to this podcast, if they thought that they'd said something and was rejected, Yeah, if they said something and were rejected, it would be much better than having to turn up to that person's funeral. Just make sure you use the word suicide or having thoughts of suicide, because if you say anything else, they'll go, actually, he's not asked me a direct question there, or they've not asked me a direct question. I can just get around this. But you get a lot of people who are precious about using the word commit suicide or the words commit suicide, because we know that it's not a crime anymore, and saying it's committing suicide can be quite triggering for people. But I would rather you say commit suicide than not say anything at all. So don't worry about saying the wrong words. Just say something. But as a bit of advice, if it was, I know I'm trained in suicide intervention, but it's quite simple. Just speak about the observations that you've had, and then say something along the lines of, in my experience, when I've seen people do this or say this, or when I hear people say things like this, it can sometimes mean that you're having thoughts of suicide. And are you having thoughts of suicide? And I promise you, in almost every case you do that, and they are, the chances are they'll thank you for noticing, and you break down that barrier. So it's really important.
Great. Okay. Well, looking at that, let's look at it then from, if somebody's listening and they're not going through a particularly good time in their life, they're not really managing sort of, external factors or whatever it is. And, maybe they're not far along the continuum you've been talking about, but, what can they do? How do you get off that train? What's your advice?
Just speak to your friends and family, if, people who are close to you, because actually it is so true that it just takes that weight off your shoulders. And in people that who are going to be receptive to it, not just dismiss you out of hand, which is one of the reasons why it's so bad for men right now, because we often get missed or dismissed when we say things, but that's a different factor. And if you haven't got those people in your life, there are a lot of men who have very few close friends. And because we often don't want to put other people out, we know our friends have got things going on in their lives, and we don't do that. So if it needs to be a separate person, if you could afford to pay for therapy, go and have some sessions with somebody. If you can't, then go to the NHS. It's 111 option 2, and speak to somebody on there, or you speak to your GP. Speak to someone and get some support. And it's really interesting, Philip, what you said about they might not be all the way down that continuum. Well, if you are on that continuum and you don't do anything, you're only going to go in one direction. So it doesn't matter where you are on that continuum. It is important that you get the help. It was once said to me by an ex-colleague of mine. They read my story, my blog on the website, and they came up to me when I was talking to one of the HR team at our work and said, "Oh, I read your story. It was really, really powerful. And I'm not where you were. I'm much further away. I'm at this point in my life, but I really appreciate you reaching out." And the HR lady was amazing. She said, "Well, what help are you getting for where you're at?" She goes, and he said, "It's all right, because I'm not where Steve is." So he was like, let's wait until we're in absolute crisis, then get help. Let's not get there.
That's really interesting. So you've started your charity, Tough to Talk, and it's obvious why you've done that. Can you tell us a bit more about it and how it works with, the community? Because it's interesting you said it's not aimed at men contemplating suicide. It's actually aimed at kind of intermediaries or other people who can take action.
Absolutely. So we're not crisis care. I mean, if you go to our website, there's a fabulous support page where you'll figure out where you are on your journey, and you can phone the relevant people or get in contact with the relevant people, because they're the experts. If men wanted to get help, they can get help because it's out there, and men will be prioritized in suicide prevention. So if they phoned up 111 option 2 and said that I'm having thoughts of suicide, they will be prioritized over women, because they are 3 times more likely to go through with it and choose a very violent method to do it as well, more than likely, and not be able to come back from it. So there's already great care out there. So if you remember the first 2 stats that really blew my mind, that is the number 1 preventable cause of death on the planet, and only 32% of men are getting help. There's a massive gap in there. So when we looked at it, We identified the stigmas, the gender biases, the toxic masculinity, all of those things, all those factors that are stopping men from speaking up. And then it turns out that there's something called cognitive dissonance, where we know something isn't right, but we still choose to do it because it's programmed into men as they're growing up to be strong and stoic and masculine. And so we know that actually talking about our feelings and talking openly with other people is the right thing to do, but we don't do it because of this cognitive dissonance. And that's where the link is between all the stuff I spoke about with stigma and everything else and the actual action of going and getting help. So we created Tough to Talk to work with, male dominated communities, construction industry, manufacturing, the FA, all of these people, because for us to get rid of that stigma, we need to have the men at the top, the men who are visible, your CEO, your manager, the leader in your little group, the guy who always has the conversation after the conversation, that man. We need those men leading a change where they can show great masculinity and be able to talk openly about what's going on. So when a young man enters a business and he looks up and sees the CEO on top of the food chain and he says, I want to be that person, but I have a mental health problem, or I have a trauma problem, or I have something that's going on in my life, he can, and then all of a sudden there's an article by the CEO, or the CEO openly talks about a time when they've had vulnerabilities. And in spite of all of that, they're still the CEO. If we're doing that enough times, then men will be more open to engaging. You couple that with great language that we use and tone of voice that is aimed more at men, because I know that brilliant as the Samaritans are and Mind are and all of those people, when you read their websites, it's not very engaging for most men. And so they go on and they go, it's not, I'll find another way. So we help organizations with their tone of voice and so on. But most importantly, we vowed to create over the next 18 months, 2,400 tough talkers. So that is men, and it's only open to men who are trained in understanding suicide intervention, but are also going out into their environments of male-dominated spaces and talking about these things, and not talking directly about suicide, but talking about the issues men face and that it's okay to talk about it. And what we hope will happen there is that will filter out then into people's homes, and then that'll filter down into the children. And then over time, we'll get rid of that generational bias, generational gender bias, and the man up culture stigma. By the way, we're re-owning man up. If anybody, so we have a man up journal, which is one of the two ways we do connect with men. We have a journal and a journal for young men, which is for school-aged boys that are going into college, and a book that's coming out. And it's called the Man Up series, because the opposite of man up is man down. And we should own man up as our word, that actually manning up, the best thing we can do is take care of ourselves and then take care of other people. So the charity works very closely with all those organizations for the suicide intervention training, the books, the journals, and we do things called tough talks. But ultimately it's about culture change. And that's the only way we can do this. The only way we can get rid of that cognitive dissonance is through culture change.
And do you think there is, you're talking about now normalizing the conversation around men's, mental ill health generally, and that it's okay. You would talk about the fact you had a cold or you'd had COVID, but you wouldn't talk about the fact that you had depression or some psychosis, etc. But do you think there are enough support organizations, and I'm talking about those that can actually help you get better? Do you think there are enough of those that are talking in the right language? Because, because you can go to your GP and the NHS, etc. I've interviewed quite a few organizations who are doing that. There's an organization just in a place called Didcot, near where I live, and, they'll send a black cab out to somebody who rings up in distress, or even from the GP surgery, and they'll take them and, they'll do an activity with them. And it's really suited to perhaps how men would want to get help. But are there enough of those? Does that need to keep up with the destigmatizing of the conversation around mental health?
The honest answer is, at the moment, yes. And this seems like it's a little bit backwards. Can we always do with more? Yeah, absolutely. And it's about supply and demand. Is there enough men going out and getting help, so we need more places to get them help? Well, the answer is no. There's a thought. If you speak to most people, they'll say to you that more men are talking now, and there are more conversations are happening. So therefore, the rate of suicide must be going down. But the rate of suicide isn't going down. The rate of suicide is going up. But the perception is that more men are talking. So the man who's phoned up that organisation in Didcot to get that taxi, kudos, buddy. That's absolutely amazing, because he's either had an epiphany, a moment where he needs to reach out like I did, or he's got higher levels of empathy and he understands what's going on with him, and he hasn't got a problem with the cognitive dissonance that we were talking about before. He hasn't got a problem with that stigma. So he's reached out. Fantastic. But what about those men, the majority of men, who are not reaching out because of the stigma? And so actually, I think to answer your question, do we need more? Yes. But is that where we need to channel most of our energy? Probably not. We need to get rid of this stigma.
And that's what Tough to Talk aims to do with its programs.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the other things I thought is that I think is really interesting is that when we were talking about the suicide continuum, we spoke about those 5 factors that most people go through that lead them to that. And with only 32% of people men taking up psychological support, what's really interesting is that you might have a man who is in his 50s. So his current life situation is he's in his 50s, his wife has left him, and they've taken the kids. He might have a past history of gambling addiction. So then he starts gambling again, and then he starts losing all his money. And he might have a past history of trauma. So he's got 3 of those factors. And then he will see plastered all over social media, all over the news, all over these men, if you've got a mental health problem, speak up. Well, he hasn't got a mental health problem. In his head, he hasn't got a mental health problem. He's got an ex-wife who hates him, has taken the kids. He's got a gambling problem, and he's got things that happened in his past that he's not dealing with. He doesn't recognize that as a mental health problem, or he chooses not to recognize it because of the dissonance. And then, so he doesn't reach out for help there. So that's a really big factor.
And so that can be combated through getting the message out in workplaces and other sorts of places where people go and socialize and exist. But I guess also what we talked about earlier, and it'd be quite nice to finish again on this just in summary, about identifying some of those symptoms. So if your mate is not behaving as you in a usual manner, then you could step in. So perhaps just for the sake of people listening who are interested, just to get a summary again of what should they be looking out for and what should they do if they think somebody they know, is in trouble.
Okay, well, this falls into 2 camps. First camp is, it doesn't matter if your friend's suffering or not. Genuinely check in on them anyway, because your mate will probably tell you they're fine. Okay, and we're always fine. Just check. Then when they say fine, ask again. Be specific. Ask again, right? So first of all, blanket across the board. Let's make it masculine and manly, just to be checking in on our buddies, right? And then secondly, is what we spoke about. What do you know about that person? What do you see in their behaviours? What do you hear them say? Sometimes it can be as obvious and still missed, but it can be something as obvious as that won't matter next week. Well, find out what's happening next week. And then lastly, be brave enough to say something, and if it's not you saying it to them directly, pick up the phone, go and see somebody, find somebody to be able to help them. There's no problem with you as an individual phoning up NHS 111 option 2 to tell them about a friend of yours. They'll give you amazing advice on how to deal with it. But ultimately, do something.
Brilliant. Well, Steve, thank you. That's been really, really useful, really interesting. Thank you for sharing information about your own experience, but also, this great advice for people. And so thank you.
No problem at all. Thank you. It's been a pleasure to be here, and it's going to really, really help us get our message out there.
Brilliant. Well, we'll put lots of links on the website with the episode.
No problem at all. Thank you.
Thank you for joining me for this episode of Midlife Men, where my guest has been Steve Whittle, founder of the men's suicide prevention charity Tough to Talk. And you can find the website at www.toughtotalk.com. If you're experiencing any of the issues raised in this episode, general advice is to talk to your doctor. There are also organisations you can call now. For example, in the UK, you can call the Samaritans on 116 123. And if you're in the US, you can call the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. If you have a suggestion for a topic you'd like us to cover in the podcast, or if you have a story you'd like to share, then please contact me either on Twitter @midlifemen or email me at midlifemen01@gmail.com. Join me next time when we talk to other midlife men about their stories, and maybe you'll find that they resonate with you. Thank you.